The crack of Tom Sinclair's whip split the air like thunder, and the woman chained to the auction block collapsed to her knees, blood streaming from the fresh welt across her cheek. The crowd of drunken miners and drifters roared their approval, waving bottles of rot-gut whiskey as they pressed closer to the makeshift platform in the alley behind Murphy's saloon. Now that's what I call proper training. Sinclair bellowed, his gold teeth glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. This here's what happens when merchandise gets uppity with its new owners. Mason Reed pushed through the jeering crowd, his weathered hands clenched into fists. He'd come to Perdition Gulch for supplies, flower medicine, maybe a new harness for his plow horse. The last thing he'd expected was to witness something that belonged in the darkest days before the war, before good men had died to end the buying and selling of human souls. 3 women stood chained together on the platform, their dresses torn and faces streaked with dirt and terror. The youngest couldn't have been more than 18, her blonde hair matted with dried blood. But it was the woman in the middle who stopped Mason's heart cold. When she lifted her head, defiance blazing in her amber eyes, despite the blood on her lips, Mason saw Sarah. Not Sarah, exactly. Sarah was 3 years dead, buried in the small cemetery behind their ranch, but the resemblance was so striking, it felt like a fist to the gut. The same stubborn tilt of the chin, the same way her dark hair caught the light, the same fierce intelligence that no amount of brutality could break. Gentlemen, we got ourselves something special today. Sinclair continued grabbing the dark-haired woman by the arm and yanking her forward. Fresh from St. Louis, this one is. Clara Whitlow, schoolteacher. Knows her letters and numbers, can teach your brats to read. Might be useful for other things too, if you know what I mean. Clara jerked away from his grip, her voice cutting through the crowd's laughter like a blade. I am not property to be sold. I demand to speak to the territorial marshal. Sinclair's backhand caught her across the mouth with a wet smack. Demand. He laughed a sound like gravel in a tin can. The only thing you get to demand, schoolmarm, is which position you prefer when your new master breaks you improper. The crowd erupted in crude laughter, but Mason felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. He'd seen enough evil during the war to recognize it. Tom Sinclair wore evil like a well-tailored coat. Bidding starts at $50, Sinclair announced. Do I hear 50 for this fine piece of educated flesh? 60, called out Jake Morrison, who ran the brothel above the saloon. His voice was thick with lust and whiskey. I got uses for a woman who can read. Clara's face went white as snow, but she didn't break. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and stared Morrison down with such contempt that the brothel keeper actually took a step back. 70, shouted another voice. 80. Mason watched the price climb, watched Clara's composure crack just slightly at the edges, and made a decision that would change all their lives. $100. He called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet crowd. Every head turned toward him. Tom Sinclair's eyes narrowed with interest and calculation. Well, well, Sinclair drawled. Mason Reed, ain't it, the war hero with a dead wife and 2 brats to raise? You sure you got that kind of money, soldier boy? Mason reached into his vest and pulled out a leather pouch, the weight of it representing nearly every cent of his savings. Right here, cash money. Now hold on, Morrison protested. I was bidding on that one. Then you should have bid higher, Mason replied without taking his eyes off Clara. Something passed between them in that moment, recognition perhaps, or just the desperate hope of one drowning person reaching for another. Sinclair's grin widened. Sold to the grieving widower, hope you get your money's worth out of her, Reed. These schoolmarms can be awful stubborn about earning their keep. As Mason counted out the bills, his hand steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing, Clara studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. He was older than she'd first thought, probably close to 40, with graying temples and lines around his eyes that spoke of hard work and harder losses. But there was something decent in his weathered features, something that gave her the first spark of hope she'd felt in weeks. "Pleasure doing business," Sinclair said, pocketing the money. "Course you understand the terms of the contract. 7 years of faithful service, or you forfeit the full value. That'd be about $400, give or take." Mason's jaw tightened. $400 was more than his ranch was worth, but he nodded. "Understood." One of Sinclair's men unlocked Clara's shackles with obvious reluctance. She rubbed her wrists where the iron had chafed them raw, her amber eyes never leaving Mason's face. "Why?" she asked simply. Mason thought of Sarah, of the promise he'd made at her graveside, to be a better man than he'd been as a husband, because some things are worth more than money. As they walked toward his wagon past the dispersing crowd of disappointed bidders, Clara caught sight of herself in the grimy window of the general store. The woman looking back was a stranger, bruised, bedraggled, hollow-eyed, with trauma. 3 weeks ago, she'd been Clara Whitlow's schoolteacher planning to start a new life in the frontier town of Silver Creek with her 2 dearest friends. Now, Mercy and Beth were dead, murdered by the animals who'd ambushed their wagon, and Clara was bound to serve a stranger for 7 years. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd found her way to the frontier, after all, just not in any way she could have imagined. "What's your name?" she asked as Mason helped her into the wagon with surprising gentleness. "Mason Reed. I have a ranch about 10 miles south of here. 2 children." Clara's heart sank. Of course he had children. Men like him always did children who needed a woman to cook and clean and tend to them. She'd traded one form of captivity for another, even if the cage was larger. "I should tell you," she said as the wagon lurched into motion, "I don't know anything about ranching. I'm a teacher. I teach children to read and cipher." Mason glanced at her with something that might have been relief. "That's exactly what I need." The Reed Ranch materialized from the heat shimmer, like something from a dream, its log walls golden in the late afternoon sun. Clara had expected something crude and rough, but the house was well built and maintained with glass windows and a wraparound porch that spoke of a man who took pride in his home. A vegetable garden flourished near the back door, and chickens pecked contentedly in a neat coop beside the barn. 2 children waited on the porch, watching the approaching wagon with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright hostility. The girl was older, maybe 11, with blonde hair braided severely back from a face that promised beauty in a few years, but currently wore the hard mask of someone who'd learned too young that the world was full of disappointment. The boy was younger, 8 or 9, with dark hair that reminded Clara painfully of her dead friend Mercy. "Anna Will," Mason called as he climbed down from the wagon. "Come meet Miss Whitlow." Neither child moved. Anna's arms were crossed defensively, her blue eyes hard as winter ice. Will hid behind his sister, peering around her shoulder with the wide-eyed wariness of a wild animal. "Oh, hello," Clara said, climbing down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could muster in her torn dress. "It's very nice to meet you both." "Why is she here?" Anna asked, her voice sharp with suspicion and something deeper, the kind of protective fury that came from losing too much too young. Mason hesitated, clearly struggling with how to explain buying a human being to his children. "Miss Whitlow is going to stay with us for a while. She's a teacher." "We don't need a teacher," Anna said flatly. "I can read just fine on my own." "Anna." Mason's voice held a warning note, but Clara stepped forward before he could continue. "What are you reading?" she asked, nodding toward the worn book clutched in Anna's hands. The girl's grip tightened possessively. "Nothing that concerns you. McGuffey's 4th Reader." Clara observed, noting the distinctive cover. "That's ambitious for someone your age. Most children don't tackle the 4th Reader until they're 12 or 13. Despite herself, Anna's hostility wavered slightly. She'd been struggling with some of the longer passages, but she'd be damned if she'd admit it to this stranger. Will crept closer, his natural curiosity overcoming his caution. Are you really a teacher, like the kind in real schools? I was, Clara said, kneeling to his level despite the protest from her bruised ribs. I taught children just like you in a big school in St. Louis. What happened to your face? Will asked with the brutal honesty of childhood, reaching out to touch the purple bruise on her cheek. Will? Mason's voice cracked with embarrassment, but Clara caught the boy's small hand gently. Some bad men hurt me, she said simply, but your father saved me from them. Are they going to come after you? Will's eyes were wide with the kind of fear that came from a child who'd already learned the world could be dangerous. Clara's smile faltered. She thought of Caleb Riker, the man who'd killed her friends and sold her like livestock, who'd promised with his pale, dead eyes that he'd find her again. I hope not, sweetheart. I really hope not. But even as she said the words, she knew they were a lie. Men like Riker didn't just disappear. They festered like infected wounds, growing more dangerous with time. That night, Clara lay in the small guest room Mason had prepared for her, staring at the wooden ceiling and listening to the foreign sounds of the ranch settling around her. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and she wondered if she would ever feel safe again. The last time she'd felt truly secure was 3 weeks ago on the road to Silver Creek, when she and Mercy and Beth had been laughing about their grand adventure. They'd been so confident, so sure they could handle whatever the frontier threw at them. Mercy had been the brave one, always ready with a joke to lift their spirits. Beth had been the practical one, insisting they carry extra water and medical supplies. And Clara had been the dreamer, the one who'd convinced them to leave their comfortable lives for something bigger. Now her friends were buried in shallow graves somewhere in the mountains, and Clara was bound to a stranger for 7 years because she'd thought she could conquer the West with nothing but determination and good intentions. She touched the bruises on her face and wondered how long it would be before her past caught up with her, because Caleb Riker wasn't the kind of man to leave loose ends, and Clara Whitlow was the loosest end of all. In the main house, Mason sat at his kitchen table staring at the few coins that remained of his life savings. $87 had been most of his ready money funds he'd been keeping for emergencies or improvements to the ranch. Now he had barely enough to buy supplies for the next month, and winter was coming fast. But when he closed his eyes, he could still see Clara Whitlow on that auction block, blood on her face and chains around her wrists, fighting for her dignity, in a world that saw her as nothing more than property. He could still hear the crowd's cruel laughter, when she demanded justice, still see the hunger in Jake Morrison's eyes. Mason had seen enough injustice during the war to last him several lifetimes. He'd fought to preserve the Union and end slavery, had lost friends and pieces of his soul to preserve the idea that all people were created equal. Coming home to find his wife dying of fever while he'd been off playing soldier had nearly broken him, but he'd held on for his children. He couldn't undo Sarah's death or bring back the friends he'd lost in places like Shiloh and Gettysburg, but he could do this one thing right. He could protect Clara Whitlow, even if it meant risking everything he'd built. The question that haunted him as he finally went to bed was simple. What would he do when her past came calling? Because men like the ones who'd hurt her didn't just vanish into the night. They came back, and when they did, they'd be hungry for blood. The first week passed like walking on eggshells. Clara moved through the house like a ghost, helping with cooking and cleaning, but speaking only when spoken to. She startled at sudden noises and flinched whenever someone approached too quickly, her amber eyes constantly scanning for threats that might not exist. Anna's hostility didn't help matters. The girl watched Clara with the intensity of a hawk, studying a field mouse ready to pounce on any sign of weakness or deception. She made pointed comments about women who came from nowhere and thought they could replace people who were meant to be remembered. Mason tried to correct her, but Anna had inherited her mother's stubborn streak and his own talent for nursing grudges. Will, by contrast, was fascinated by their mysterious house guest. He followed Clara around like a puppy, asking endless questions about St. Louis, about teaching about the wide world beyond their isolated ranch. Clara answered him as best she could, but Mason could see the effort it cost her to maintain even that minimal level of interaction. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Clara dropped a plate while washing dishes. The crash of shattering china triggered something primal and terrifying in her mind, sending her into a panic attack that left her cowering in the corner of the kitchen, her arms wrapped around her head protectively. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above her ragged breathing. "Please, I didn't mean to break it. I'll pay for it somehow. Just don't hurt me again." Mason approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, speaking in the same gentle tone he'd use with a spooked horse. "Clara, it's all right. It's just a plate. Nobody's going to hurt you." But Clara couldn't hear him. She was somewhere else, somewhere dark and brutal, reliving whatever hell she'd endured before ending up on that auction block. It took nearly 10 minutes for the panic to pass and for her to see him clearly again. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with shame as she uncurled from her defensive position. "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," Mason replied firmly. "Nothing at all." Anna had watched the entire scene from the kitchen doorway, her young face pale with shock. For the first time since Clara's arrival, she seemed to understand that this wasn't some calculating woman trying to worm her way into their family. This was someone broken, possibly beyond repair. That afternoon, Anna found Clara sitting on the front porch, staring at the mountains with hollow eyes. The girl sat down beside her, awkward and uncertain in the way of children trying to navigate adult emotions. "My mama used to drop things too," Anna said quietly. "Near the end, when the fever made her hands shake. She'd try to help with chores, but she couldn't hold on to anything properly. Papa never got angry with her. He just held her hands until they stopped shaking." Clara looked at the girl with surprise. It was the first time Anna had mentioned her mother without hostility or accusation. "She sounds like she was very special," Clara said softly. "She was the best mother in the whole world." Anna's voice was fierce with loyalty. "She used to read to us every night, even when she was too sick to sit up. She'd make up different voices for all the characters, and she'd act out the exciting parts." "What was her favorite story?" Anna hesitated, then said, "Cinderella. She said every girl deserved a happy ending, even if the world seemed determined to give her a sad one." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Your mother sounds like she was very wise." "She was, and she's never coming back." Anna's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, in the way children learn to be when they'd accepted hard truths. "Papa thinks we need a new mother, but we don't. We've managed just fine without one." "I'm not trying to replace your mother," Clara said gently. "I couldn't even if I wanted to. I'm just trying to survive." "Same as you." Anna studied her face with the penetrating gaze she'd inherited from both parents. "The bad men who hurt you. Are they coming back?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. "I don't know. I hope not. But you think they will?" "Yes," Clara admitted. "I think they will." Anna nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Then we better get ready to fight them." That evening, Anna did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She asked her father to read her a bedtime story, and when he finished, she asked if Miss Clara could help her with some of the harder words in her reader. It was a small step, but it felt like a victory to everyone involved. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Mason was in the barn, mending a broken harness, when he heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching the house. He looked out to see 4 riders coming up the path, Tom Sinclair, and 3 of his men, their weapons clearly visible, and their intentions unclear. Mason's hand moved instinctively to his Colt, but he forced himself to remain calm. The Sinclairs were dangerous, but they were also businessmen. As long as he didn't give them an excuse for violence, They'd probably keep things civilized. Read. Sinclair called out cheerfully as he dismounted. Hope you don't mind us dropping by uninvited. Wanted to check on our investment. Your investment? Mason stepped out of the barn, his thumbs hooked casually in his gun belt. The schoolmarm, of course. She's been awful quiet lately. Some folks in town are starting to wonder if she's thinking about running out on her contract. Mason's jaw tightened. She's not running anywhere. She's helping with my children's education exactly as intended. Education. Sinclair's grin was unpleasant, full of insinuation. Is that what you're calling it? Hope you're getting your money's worth. I am. Good to hear. Because there's been some interesting developments you should know about. Sinclair's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. Word is, there's a federal deputy looking for her. Man by the name of Caleb Riker. Claims she's wanted for theft and murder back in Missouri. Mason felt his blood turn to ice water. What kind of charges? Oh, the usual. Says she killed 2 women and made off with her traveling money. Got himself a federal warrant and everything. Sinclair pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and waved it tauntingly. Course, I told him she was legally bound to you bought and paid for. But if she's a murderer, she's not a murderer. How can you be sure? What do you really know about her, Reed? Could be anybody hiding behind that pretty face. Could be running from anything. Mason stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She's under my protection. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me personally. Sinclair's smile widened, but there was something sharp and predatory in his eyes now. Easy there, soldier boy. No need to get hostile. Just thought you should know what kind of trouble might be heading your way. Is that a threat? Just friendly advice between neighbors. Perdition Gulch can be dangerous for folks who don't understand how things work around here. After the Sinclairs rode away, Mason found Clara in the kitchen, her face white as bleached bone. She'd heard every word through the open window. Riker's here. She said, her voice barely above a whisper. He found me. Who is he, Clara? What does he want? For a moment, Clara seemed to shrink in on herself, becoming smaller and more fragile. Then she straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. He's the one who killed my friends, she said. He's the devil who's been hunting me. And finally, the whole truth came spilling out like blood from an opened vein. The 3 young women from St. Louis who thought they could tame the frontier with nothing but courage and determination. The ambush on the mountain road that had shattered their dreams and their lives. The bandits who'd slaughtered their escort and stolen their supplies, their money, their futures. Mercy tried to run. Clara said, her voice flat and emotionless as she recounted the nightmare. She made it maybe 20 yards before Riker shot her in the back. Beth begged him to let us go. She offered him her jewelry, her mother's wedding ring, everything we had. He laughed and put a bullet through her head. And you? He said I was too pretty to kill outright. Said I'd fetch a good price in the right market. Clara's hands shook as she continued. He kept me chained for 4 days while he decided what to do with me. Then he sold me to Sinclair for $60 and a bottle of whiskey. Mason felt a rage building inside him, cold and implacable as a mountain winter. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I was afraid you'd hand me over to save yourself and your children. Because I thought if you knew how much danger I'd bring to your family, you'd decide I wasn't worth the risk. Mason reached out and took her trembling hands in his steady ones. Listen to me very carefully. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. Not Riker, not Sinclair, not the devil himself. Do you understand? You can't fight them all. Clara protested. You have children to think about. You can't risk their lives for someone like me. Mason's grip tightened. Watch me. But even as he made the promise, he wondered if he'd be able to keep it. Caleb Riker wasn't some common road agent. He was a predator a man who'd murdered 2 innocent women without hesitation and tortured a third for his own twisted pleasure. And now he had federal authority behind him, which made him more dangerous than any outlaw. The psychological warfare began immediately. Dead animals appeared on their doorstep, rabbits with their throats cut, chickens with their necks wrung. Windows were broken by thrown rocks in the dead of night. Mysterious figures were spotted lurking in the tree line, always vanishing when Mason tried to investigate. Clara barely slept, and when she did manage to doze, she was plagued by nightmares that left her screaming. The children were frightened and confused, unable to understand why their peaceful life had suddenly become a waking horror. "I can't take much more of this," Clara confessed to Mason one evening as they sat on the porch, both of them armed and watching the shadows. "I'm falling apart piece by piece." "You're stronger than you think," Mason replied. "You survived whatever Riker did to you before. You'll survive this too." But at what cost? Anna hasn't smiled in days. "Will keeps asking why the bad man wants to hurt us. They're children, Mason. They shouldn't have to live like this because of my past." Mason was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and red. Sarah used to say that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. "Your wife sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was. And she would have done exactly what you're doing, fought to protect her family no matter the cost." Mason looked at Clara with eyes full of gentle understanding. "You remind me of her sometimes. Same stubborn streak when it comes to doing what's right." Clara felt tears burning her eyes. "I don't feel like I'm fighting. I feel like I'm just hiding, waiting for him to decide when and how to destroy us. Sometimes surviving is the bravest thing you can do. Sometimes just refusing to break is an act of defiance." But that night, as Clara lay awake listening to the ranch settle around her, she wondered how much longer they could maintain this siege mentality. How long before Riker's patience ran out, and he decided to escalate from psychological torture to outright violence. The answer came sooner than any of them expected, and it came with a fury that would test every bond they'd managed to forge. The note was written in Riker's distinctive scrawl, the letters harsh and angular like claw marks on paper. Clara found it pinned to Will's bedroom door with a rusty nail, the metal driven so deep into the wood that she had to work it free with a kitchen knife. "The boy dies at midnight unless you come alone to the old mine. Bring a lantern and prepare to pay for your sins." Clara's hands shook as she read the words, her mind immediately racing to the worst possible conclusions. She checked Will's room and found it empty, his bed still made from the morning. A quick search of the house revealed that Anna was safe in her room, reading by lamplight, but Will was nowhere to be found. "Mason," she called, her voice cracking with panic. He appeared within seconds, his rifle in his hands, and his eyes already scanning for threats. When he saw the note, his face went white as winter snow. "Nons. When did you last see Will?" he asked, his voice deadly calm, in the way of men who'd learned to function under extreme stress. "After supper. He said he was going to check on the chickens." They searched every inch of the ranch, the barn, the outbuildings, the chicken coop, and even the root cellar. But Will had vanished as completely as morning mist. The only clue was a set of hoof prints leading away from the property toward the abandoned Redemption mine, an old copper excavation that had been worked out and left to rot years ago. Anna appeared in the kitchen doorway, her young face tight with fear. "What's happening? Where's Will?" Mason knelt beside his daughter, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "The bad man took your brother, but we're going to get him back." "I'm coming with you," Anna said immediately. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. Will is my brother, too." Anna's voice carried an edge of steel that reminded Mason painfully of Sarah. "And I'm not staying here alone while you and Miss Clara go off to fight. Mason looked at his daughter and saw the determination burning in her blue eyes. He knew that look. It meant Anna had made up her mind, and no amount of argument would change it. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "But you stay behind us, you do exactly what I tell you, and if things go bad, you run. No heroics, no arguments." "Understood?" Anna nodded gravely. "Understood." They armed themselves quickly, Mason with his Winchester and Colt Clara with the spare rifle he'd taught her to use, and Anna with the small Derringer that had belonged to her mother. As they prepared to leave, Clara caught Mason's arm. "This is my fault," she said. "Will is in danger because of me. If something happens to him, nothing's going to happen to him." Mason interrupted. "We're going to get him back, all of us together. That's what families do." The word family hit Clara like a physical blow. In all the chaos and fear, she'd somehow forgotten that these people had claimed her as one of their own, that she was no longer alone in the world. "Promise me something," she said as they mounted their horses. "If it comes down to a choice between Will and me, you choose Will. No hesitation, no debate. He's innocent in all this." "It won't come to that," Mason said firmly. But Clara could see in his eyes that he was already making the same calculations. She was already preparing for the possibility that someone might have to be sacrificed to save the others. The redemption mine crouched against the mountainside like a sleeping beast, its entrance yawning black and ominous in the moonlight. The old timbers that framed the opening were rotted and sagging, and the whole structure looked ready to collapse at the slightest provocation. A single lantern hung from a post near the entrance, casting dancing shadows that made the surrounding rocks seem to move and breathe. As they approached, they could hear Will's voice echoing from somewhere deep in the tunnels. Not screaming, but calling out in the steady, rhythmic way of someone trying to stay calm. "I'm here, Papa, I can hear you coming." Mason felt a surge of pride mixed with relief. His son was scared, but not broken, which meant they still had a chance. "Well, that's my brave boy," he called back. "Hold tight, Will. We're coming to get you." "Nar, how touching," came another voice from the darkness. Caleb Riker stepped into the circle of lantern light, and Clara felt her blood turn to ice at the sight of him. He was exactly as she remembered, tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to look right through a person's soul. His face was marked with new scars from their last encounter, and there was something in his expression that spoke of pain and madness mixed together into something truly dangerous. "Miss Clara Whitlow," Riker said with mock courtesy. "So good of you to accept my invitation. And you brought the whole family, too. How democratic." "Where's my son?" Mason demanded, his rifle trained on Riker's chest. Safe for the moment. But that could change real quick, depending on how this conversation goes. Riker's hand rested casually on the butt of his gun. "See, I've got a proposition for all of you." "We're listening," Clara said, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "It's simple, really. You come with me, schoolmarm, and the boy goes free. Try anything clever, and he takes a very long fall down a very deep shaft. What do you say?" Clara looked at Mason and Anna, these people who'd become her anchor in a world gone mad. She thought about Will somewhere in the darkness, counting on the adults to save him. She thought about her friends Mercy and Beth, who died because they'd trusted her judgment. "All right," she said, setting down her rifle. "I'll come with you." "Clara, no," Mason said urgently. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," she replied, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "This is how it has to end." But as Clara took a step toward Riker, Anna suddenly spoke up. "Wait," the girl said, her voice carrying a note of desperate inspiration. "What if I told you there was something more valuable than revenge? Something that could make you rich beyond your wildest dreams?" Riker's eyes narrowed with interest. "What are you babbling about, little girl?" "Gold," Anna said simply. There's a cave about 2 miles from here, hidden in the rocks. My father's been mining it secretly for months. That's how he had enough money to buy Miss Clara. Mason stared at his daughter in shock. There was no gold mine, no secret cache of nuggets. Anna was lying with the skill of a seasoned gambler, but to what end? That's a pretty story, Riker said skeptically. But why should I believe you? Because I can prove it, Anna replied, reaching into her pocket and pulling out what looked like a small nugget of gold. This is just a sample. There's pounds more where this came from. Clara recognized the nugget as a piece of brass from Mason's toolkit, polished until it gleamed like precious metal. Anna was taking an enormous risk, gambling their lives on her ability to deceive a dangerous man. Interesting, Riker mused. But even if you're telling the truth, why should I let any of you live to tell tales about my newfound wealth? Because you'll need workers, Anna said quickly. Mining is dangerous work, especially in these mountains. You'll need people who know the area who can help you get the gold out safely. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the mine entrance. Then Riker made his decision. "Show me," he said. "But understand this if you're lying. If this is some kind of trick that the boy dies first. Then the rest of you slow and painful." Anna nodded, her young face set with grim determination. "I understand. Follow me." As they began walking away from the mine, Clara caught Mason's eye and saw her own desperate hope reflected there. Anna had bought them time and mobility, but she'd also put them all in even greater danger. If her deception was discovered, Riker would kill them all without hesitation. The question was, what did Anna have planned, and would any of them live to see it succeed? Anna led them through the moonlit landscape with the confidence of someone who'd grown up exploring every inch of the territory. She took them along game trails and over rocky outcroppings, always moving upward toward the higher elevations, where the mountains became truly dangerous. Clara found herself walking beside Riker, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath and see the madness burning in his pale eyes. He kept one hand on his gun and the other ready to grab her if she tried to run, but his attention was focused on Anna and the promise of gold. "Smart little girl," he said conversationally. "Reminds me of myself at that age. Always thinking, always scheming. She'll go far in this world, assuming she lives long enough." "She's just a child," Clara replied. "She doesn't deserve to be dragged into this." "Deserve?" Riker laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Nobody gets what they deserve, schoolmarm. The good die young and the wicked prosper. That's just the way of things." "Is that what you tell yourself, that you're just following the natural order?" "I tell myself the truth. I'm a predator, and the rest of you are prey. Some prey runs some fights, but in the end, we all end up the same way." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Riker wasn't just evil, he was completely without conscience, viewing other people as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. Behind them, Mason walked with his rifle ready, his eyes constantly scanning for opportunities. He'd figured out that Anna was leading them somewhere specific, somewhere she considered advantageous, but he couldn't guess what his 11-year-old daughter had in mind. All he could do was trust her judgment and be ready to act when the moment came. They climbed for nearly an hour, following increasingly treacherous paths that wound around massive boulders and across narrow ledges. The drop-offs became more severe as they ascended, and Clara found herself fighting vertigo as she looked down into the black canyons below. Finally, Anna stopped at what appeared to be a dead end, a narrow ledge that jutted out over a precipitous drop into Devil's Canyon, a notorious landmark that had claimed the lives of unwary travelers for generations. "Here," Anna said, pointing to a small cave opening barely visible in the rock face. "The gold is in there." Riker studied the cave with suspicion. "Looks awful small for a working mine." "Gold doesn't take up much space," Anna replied with the confidence of youth. Papa says even a handful of nuggets can be worth hundreds of dollars. Smart man, your papa. Keeping quiet about something like this. Riker moved toward the cave entrance, but his caution made him pause. You first, little girl. Show me this treasure of yours. Anna glanced back at her father, and Mason saw something pass between them, a look of understanding that chilled him to the bone. His daughter was planning something desperate, something that might save them all or get them all killed. Anna, no, he started to say, but she was already moving. Instead of entering the cave, Anna suddenly spun around and shoved Riker as hard as she could. The outlaw, caught completely off guard by the attack from an 11-year-old girl, stumbled backward toward the edge of the precipice. For a heart-stopping moment, he teetered on the brink, his arms windmilling frantically as he fought for balance. His pale eyes were wide with shock and fury, and his mouth opened in a curse that was cut short when gravity finally claimed him. Riker's scream echoed off the canyon walls as he plunged into the darkness below, the sound growing fainter until it was swallowed entirely by the night. For several seconds, nobody moved or spoke. Then Will's voice drifted up from somewhere far below, thin and terrified, but unmistakably alive. Papa, help me, I'm stuck." Mason rushed to the edge and peered down into the gloom. About 30 feet below, he could make out a narrow ledge where his son was clinging to the rock face, probably placed there by Riker as insurance against exactly this kind of betrayal. Hold on, Will," Mason called down. "I'm coming to get you. Papa, I can't hold on much longer. My hands are slipping." Without hesitation, Mason began tying his rope around a sturdy pine tree that grew near the ledge. Clara, help me with this. We need to get down there fast." As they worked to secure the rope, Clara kept glancing nervously at the spot where Riker had disappeared. "Do you think he's dead?" Anna finished grimly. "I hope so. But men like him are hard to kill." Mason tested the rope's strength, then began his descent into the canyon. The rock face was treacherous, covered with loose stones and patches of slick lichen that made every handhold uncertain. But he'd done his share of climbing during the war, and desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Will was exactly where Mason had spotted him, clinging to a narrow outcropping with the kind of desperate strength that came from knowing the alternative was death. His face was streaked with tears, but he was conscious and alert. "I knew you'd come, Papa," Will said as Mason reached him. "I knew you wouldn't leave me." "Never," Mason replied, securing the safety rope around his son's waist. "We're family. We don't leave family behind." The climb back up was harrowing, with Will's extra weight making every movement treacherous. But they made it to the top just as the eastern sky began to show the first pale hints of dawn. Clara swept Will into her arms the moment he was safe, holding him with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who'd almost lost her child. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" "I'm okay," Will said, though his voice was shaky with reaction. "He was mean, but he didn't really hurt me. He said he was saving that for when Miss Clara came to trade herself for me." Anna knelt beside her brother, her young face etched with guilt. "I'm sorry I couldn't get to you sooner. I had to make him think I was cooperating. Alex, you saved us all," Mason said, pulling both his children into a fierce embrace. "You were braver than any soldier I ever served with." But their relief was short-lived. As they prepared to make their way back down the mountain, a voice drifted up from the canyon below, weak and filled with pain, but unmistakably alive. "This isn't over, schoolmarm, you hear me? This isn't over." Caleb Riker had survived the fall, probably cushioned by the same ledge system that had saved Will. He was hurt possibly badly, but he was alive, and still determined to finish what he'd started. "We need to get out of here," Mason said grimly. "He'll find a way up eventually, and when he does, he'll be more dangerous than ever." They made their way down the mountain as quickly as the treacherous terrain would allow, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound might be Riker tracking them through the wilderness. It took them most of the morning to reach the ranch, and by then Clara was jumping at every bird call and gust of wind. The psychological warfare was taking its toll, wearing down her defenses piece by piece. "Maybe we should just leave," she said as they approached the house. "Pack up and go somewhere far away where he can't find us." "This is our home," Anna said fiercely. "We're not running away." "Anna's right," Mason agreed. "Running would just delay the inevitable. Riker won't give up no matter how far we go. The only way to end this is to end him." But ending Caleb Riker proved to be more complicated than any of them had anticipated. Over the next few days, reports began filtering in from town. Riker had been seen, despite his injuries, moving carefully through the shadows, recruiting help from the dregs of Perdition Gulch's criminal underworld. The man was like a wounded animal, more dangerous than ever, because he had nothing left to lose. His reputation was in ruins, his body was broken, and his mind was teetering on the edge of complete madness. The only thing that kept him going was his obsession with making Clara pay for his humiliation. Mason tried to maintain their vigilance, but it was exhausting. Every night brought new harassments, poisoned livestock, sabotaged equipment, cryptic messages left where they'd be sure to find them. The children were pale and nervous, jumping at shadows and losing weight from lack of sleep. "We can't keep living like this," Clara said one evening as they sat on the porch, both armed and watching the tree line. "It's destroying all of us." "I know," Mason replied. "But what choice do we have?" "The law won't help us. Sheriff Dodson is in Sinclair's pocket, and even if he wasn't, Riker has federal authority." "Then we make our own law," Anna said from the doorway, where she'd been listening to their conversation. "We stop waiting for him to come to us and start hunting him instead." Mason turned to look at his daughter, startled by the cold determination in her voice. "Anna, you're 11 years old. You shouldn't have to think about things like hunting men." "But I do have to think about it," Anna replied matter-of-factly. "Because he's not going to stop, is he? He's going to keep coming after us until one of us is dead." The stark truth of it hit them all like a physical blow. Riker wasn't interested in money or revenge in any conventional sense. He was a predator who'd marked them as his prey, and he wouldn't stop until he'd consumed them all. That night, as Clara lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, she made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't keep putting this family at risk, couldn't keep dragging innocent children into her nightmare. She would end this herself one way or another. The next morning, Clara left a note on Mason's pillow and slipped out of the house before dawn. She took one of the horses and Mason's spare rifle, along with enough supplies for several days in the wilderness. Her plan was simple: find Riker's hideout and finish what Anna had started at Devil's Canyon. But Caleb Riker was a predator with decades of experience hunting human prey. He'd been expecting exactly this kind of move, and he was ready for her. Clara made it barely 5 miles from the ranch before she rode into his trap. A rope stretched across the trail brought her horse down hard, throwing her from the saddle and into a grove of aspen trees. Before she could recover her rifle, Riker stepped out of the shadows with his gun trained on her heart. "Well, well," he said with a grin that was more frightening than any scowl. "The schoolmarm finally grew some backbone. Too bad it's going to get her killed." He looked terrible. His face was cut and bruised from the fall, one arm hung useless at his side, and there was something wrong with the way he was standing. But his gun hand was steady, and his pale eyes burned with undiminished malice. "You've led me quite a chase," Riker continued conversationally. "But all good things must come to an end. Time to pay for what you've cost me. And what I've cost you." Clara struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain in her ribs where she'd hit the ground. "You murdered my friends. You sold me like livestock. Everything that's happened to you is justice. Justice." Riker laughed a sound like grinding glass. "There's no such thing as justice, schoolmarm. There's just the strong taking what they want from the weak. Why don't you just end this and get it over with? Because death is too easy, too quick. Riker's grin widened, showing teeth stained with blood. I want you to suffer first. I want you to know that everyone you care about is going to die because of your selfishness. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Mason appeared through the trees, his rifle ready, and his face set with grim determination. Behind him rode Anna and Will, both armed and looking far older than their years. "Let her go, Riker," Mason called out. "Your fight is with me now." "Is it?" Riker swung his gun toward the approaching riders. "Seems to me my fight is with anyone who gets in my way, starting with those children of yours." What happened next unfolded with a terrible clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of extreme crisis. Riker fired at Anna, his bullet going wide, but close enough to make her horse rear and dump her from the saddle. Mason returned fire, his shot taking Riker in the shoulder and spinning him around. But the outlaw was far from finished. Even wounded and outnumbered, he fought with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. He rolled behind a fallen log and continued shooting, forcing the family to take cover behind trees and rocks. "Now this is taking too long," Riker called out during a brief lull in the gunfire. "Time to end this properly." He pulled something from his belt, a stick of dynamite, with a shortened fuse, probably stolen from one of the mining operations around Perdition Gulch. "Say goodbye to your family, schoolmarm." The explosion shattered the morning quiet like thunder, sending trees crashing down and filling the air with smoke and debris. When the dust settled, Clara found herself pinned under a fallen branch, her ears ringing and her vision blurred. Through the chaos, she could see Mason struggling to reach his children, who were trapped behind a pile of boulders. Anna appeared to be unconscious, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead, while Will was crying but seemed unhurt. Riker emerged from the smoke like an avenging demon, his clothes torn and his face blackened with soot, but his gun still steady in his hand. "Now we finish this," he said, approaching Clara with deliberate slowness. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd forgotten about the dynamite's effect on the terrain. The explosion had destabilized the entire area, turning solid ground into a maze of loose rocks and hidden pitfalls. As Riker raised his gun for the killing shot, the ground beneath his feet gave way. He plunged into a crevice that had been opened by the blast, his scream of rage and fear echoing off the canyon walls. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Mason was beside Clara, helping her free herself from the fallen branch and checking her for serious injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "I'm all right. The children, they're okay. Shaken up, but okay." Mason helped her to her feet, his strong hands gentle despite the urgency of the situation. "Is he dead this time?" They approached the crevice, cautiously peering down into the darkness. The opening was narrow and deep, disappearing into the bowels of the earth. There was no sign of movement, no sound from below. If he survived that fall and the one at Devil's Canyon, he's tougher than any man has a right to be, Mason said grimly. Anna appeared beside them, her head bandaged, but her eyes clear and alert. "He's dead," she said with the certainty of someone who'd seen enough of death to recognize it. Nobody could survive a fall like that. Will joined them, clinging to Clara's hand with the desperate grip of a child who'd almost lost someone precious. "Is it over now? Are we safe?" "Yes, sweetheart," Clara said, pulling him into a fierce hug. "It's over. We're all safe now." But even as she said the words, she couldn't quite believe them. She'd been running from Caleb Riker for so long that safety felt like a foreign concept, something that belonged to other people's lives. As they made their way back to the ranch, Clara found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this place. She'd lost her identity, her friends, and nearly her life. But she'd also found something she'd never had before, a family that would fight for her people, who saw her as worth protecting. "Clara," Mason said as they rode through the familiar landscape of his ranch, "there's something I need to tell you." "What is it?" "When I bought your contract from Sinclair, I wasn't just trying to save you. I was trying to save myself too." His voice was quiet, almost lost in the sound of the horse's hooves. "I'd been drifting since Sarah died, just going through the motions of living. But when I saw you on that platform, fighting for your dignity, even when everything seemed hopeless, it reminded me what it meant to be alive." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Mason, I'm not asking for anything." He continued quickly. "I know you have your own life to live, your own choices to make now that you're free. But I want you to know that these past weeks, having you as part of our family, they've been the best I've had in years." Clara was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything they'd been through together. The fear, the danger, the moments of unexpected tenderness that had grown between them like flowers blooming in unlikely soil. "I don't want to go anywhere," she said finally. "This is my home now. You and Anna and Will, you're my family, if you'll have me." Mason's smile was brighter than the morning sun. "We'll have you, Clara Whitlow, for as long as you want to stay." But there was still one more revelation to come, one more secret that would change everything they thought they knew about each other. 3 days later, as life at the ranch slowly returned to something resembling normal, Deputy Marshal Henry Wade arrived with news that would shake them all to their core. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said as they gathered in the kitchen, his weathered face grave with official business, "I'm afraid there's been a development in your case." Clara felt her heart sink. What kind of development? Wade pulled out a folder thick with official documents. "We've been investigating Caleb Riker's activities over the past several years, trying to piece together the full extent of his crimes. What we found, well, it changes everything." He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, a formal portrait of a young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. "Do you recognize this person?" Clara stared at the image, her face going white. That's Clara Whitlow. The real Clara Whitlow. She died of cholera in St. Louis 2 years ago," Wade continued. "Which means you've been using the identity of a dead woman. The question is, who are you really?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mason stared at the woman he'd come to love, realizing that he didn't even know her real name. Anna and Will looked confused and frightened, sensing that something fundamental was about to change. "My name is Elizabeth Hartwell," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was married to Jacob Whitlow. He took my maiden name when we wed. Clara was my dearest friend, and when she died, when Jacob disappeared owing money to dangerous men, I took her identity to escape." "What happened to your husband?" Wade asked gently. Elizabeth's hands shook as she continued her confession. "Jacob was a gambler and a drunk. He owed over $1,000 to men who don't forgive debts. One night he just vanished, leaving me to face his creditors alone. They said I could work off his debt in one of their establishments, or I could disappear like Jacob had. So you became Clara Whitlow." I stole her papers, her teaching certificate, her letters of recommendation. I convinced Mercy and Beth that I was their friend Clara, come back from the dead with a new opportunity out west. Elizabeth's voice broke. "They died because they trusted me, because I lied to them." Mason reached out and took her trembling hands. "You were trying to survive. That's not a crime, isn't it?" Elizabeth looked at him with eyes full of pain. "I stole a dead woman's identity. I deceived my friends. I brought danger and death to everyone I cared about." Deputy Marshal Wade cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hartwell, the federal government has been investigating the criminal organization that your husband was involved with. Your testimony about their activities, combined with what we know about Riker's crimes, could help us bring down a network that's been operating across 3 territories. What are you asking? Cooperation. Full disclosure about everything that happened from your husband's disappearance, to your friend's murders, to Riker's pursuit. In exchange, the government is prepared to offer you immunity from prosecution and a fresh start. Elizabeth looked around at the faces of her chosen family, Mason steady and supportive, Anna trying to hide her confusion, Will clinging to her skirt with the innocent faith of childhood. "What about the children?" she asked. "What about Mason? If I testify, will they be safe?" "Safer than you've been in months," Wade assured her. "With Riker dead and the Sinclair organization under federal investigation, you'll finally be free to live normal lives." But Elizabeth had learned not to trust promises of safety. "And if I refuse to testify, then you remain Elizabeth Hartwell, former identity thief, wanted for questioning in connection with your husband's disappearance and your friend's murders." Wade's voice was not unkind, but it was implacable. "The choice is yours." It wasn't really a choice at all, and everyone in the room knew it. Elizabeth had to choose between her past and her future, between the secrets she'd carried and the family she'd found. "I'll testify," she said finally. "I'll tell you everything." The next few weeks passed in a blur of depositions and federal investigations. Elizabeth told her story again and again, each repetition painful, but somehow cleansing. She testified about Jacob's debts and disappearance, about the criminals who'd threatened her, about her desperate decision to steal Clara's identity. She described in excruciating detail the journey west with Mercy and Beth, the ambush that had killed her friends, and the weeks of torture and terror that had followed. She explained Riker's obsession with silencing witnesses, his connections to the Sinclair organization, and the systematic campaign of intimidation that had nearly destroyed her sanity. Through it all, Mason and the children stood by her. They attended court sessions when they could, offered comfort when the memories became too painful, and gradually helped her understand that her past didn't define her future. The federal investigation moved quickly once Elizabeth's testimony provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. The Sinclair organization was revealed to be part of a much larger criminal network that trafficked in everything from stolen goods to human beings. Tom Sinclair and his brothers were arrested on federal charges that would keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. Sheriff Dodson was removed from office and charged with corruption. The other women who'd been held under false indenture contracts were freed and given assistance in starting new lives. Perdition Gulch itself began to transform from a lawless mining town into a legitimate community. And through it all, Elizabeth Hartwell slowly learned to believe that she might actually deserve the happiness that had found her. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning when the aspens had turned gold and the mountain air carried the promise of winter. Elizabeth wore Sarah's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, but somehow perfect in its simplicity. Anna served as maid of honor, her young face radiant with joy, while Will stood proudly beside his father as best man. The ceremony was held in the newly built church in Perdition Gulch, with Deputy Marshal Wade giving away the bride and most of the town in attendance. It was a celebration not just of two people finding love, but of a community coming together after years of fear and oppression. "Do you, Mason Reed, take Elizabeth Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded wife?" asked Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher who'd agreed to perform the ceremony. "I do," Mason said, his voice strong and clear. "And do you, Elizabeth Hartwell, take Mason Reed to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Elizabeth looked into Mason's eyes, seeing reflected there all the love and acceptance she'd never dared hope for. "I do. And then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." As Mason leaned down to kiss his new wife, Elizabeth felt something settle into place in her soul, a sense of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. The long nightmare was finally over, and the dream she'd never dared dream was just beginning. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung between the trees. The whole community came out to celebrate, miners and merchants, ranchers and farmers, all united in their joy for the couple who'd helped bring justice to their town. As the evening wore on and the dancing began, Elizabeth found herself standing apart for a moment, watching her new family and friends with wonder. Anna was teaching some of the younger children a complicated dance step, her laughter bright as silver bells. Will was racing around with a pack of boys his age, his face flushed with excitement and joy. And Mason was deep in conversation with some of the other ranchers, his hand never far from Elizabeth's shoulder. "Regrets?" asked Deputy Marshal Wade, appearing beside her with 2 cups of punch. "None," Elizabeth replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "Well, maybe one." "What's that?" "I wish Mercy and Beth could have been here to see this. They would have loved the children, and they would have been so happy to see me finally finding peace." Wade nodded thoughtfully. "I think they would be proud of you. You survived, you found justice for their deaths, and you built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. That's not nothing." "No," Elizabeth agreed, watching Anna spin Will around in a dizzy circle while he shrieked with laughter. "It's everything." Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the children were finally asleep, Elizabeth and Mason sat together on their front porch, looking up at the stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air. "Happy?" Mason asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Elizabeth replied. "There were times when I thought I'd never feel safe again, never be able to trust anyone or believe in tomorrow. And now I know that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love someone enough to fight for them, to stand by them no matter what. It's about building something together that's stronger than anything trying to tear it apart." Mason squeezed her gently. "Sarah used to say something similar. She said love wasn't a feeling, it was a decision you made every day. She was a wise woman. I hope I can live up to her example." "You already have," Mason said softly. "You've shown Anna what it means to be strong in the face of adversity. You've taught Will that kindness and courage can coexist. And you've reminded me that it's possible to love again after loss." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch settling around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon, but the sound no longer held any fear for Elizabeth. This was her home, her sanctuary, her place of peace in a sometimes violent world. "Elizabeth," Mason said eventually, "there's something I want to give you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth with age and handling. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a simple gold ring, set with a small but perfect diamond. "This was Sarah's," he said. "I know it might seem strange, but I think she would want you to have it. She always said it wasn't the ring that mattered, but the promise it represented." Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes as she looked at the ring. "Mason, I can't. This was hers, and now it's yours," Mason said firmly. "You're not replacing Sarah Elizabeth. You're continuing the story she started. You're making sure her children grow up in a home filled with love." With trembling fingers, Elizabeth allowed Mason to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. "There," Mason said with satisfaction. "Now it's official. You're not just Elizabeth Hartwell anymore, or even Elizabeth Reed. You're home." 1 year later, Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the new Perdition Gulch schoolhouse, watching her students work on their arithmetic problems. The building was small, but well appointed, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light and a wood stove that would keep the children warm during the harsh mountain winters. Anna and Will sat in the front row, both having grown considerably over the past year. Anna, now 12, had developed into a confident young woman who helped Elizabeth with the younger children and showed a natural aptitude for teaching. Will, at 9, was one of the best readers in the class and had developed a particular fascination with natural science and geography. The other students came from all over the territory, children of miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and federal marshals. Some had never attended school before, while others had received some education elsewhere before their families moved west. Elizabeth had learned to work with children at all levels, creating individualized lessons that challenged each student appropriately. The work was demanding, but deeply rewarding. She'd found her true calling in this frontier classroom, teaching children who were hungry for knowledge, and whose parents understood that education could mean the difference between success and failure in this harsh land. After school, she walked home to the ranch, which had prospered considerably over the past year. Mason had used reward money from Riker's capture to expand their land holdings and livestock operations, and the ranch was now one of the most successful in the territory. More importantly, it had become a symbol of hope for other families trying to build new lives in the wilderness. "How was school today?" Mason asked as she entered the kitchen, looking up from the account books he'd been working on. "Wonderful." Tommy Martinez finally mastered long division, and Sarah Hendricks read 3 chapters of Little Women without any help at all. And our 2 scholars, Anna helped me organize the new library books that came in from Denver, and Will gave a presentation about butterfly life cycles that was better than anything I heard in teachers' college. Mason chuckled. Sarah would be so proud of them, of all of us. It was the first time in months that he'd mentioned his first wife, and Elizabeth felt the familiar flutter of uncertainty. But then she realized there was no jealousy in her heart, only gratitude that Sarah had raised such wonderful children, and that Mason had learned to love deeply enough to risk it again. She would, Elizabeth agreed. I think she'd be especially proud of how Anna has grown into such a caring, responsible young woman. Speaking of Anna, Mason said, she asked me something interesting yesterday. What was that? She wanted to know if it would be all right to start calling you Mama instead of Miss Elizabeth. Elizabeth felt her heart skip a beat. Throughout their time together, Anna had maintained a careful distance, using formal address that acknowledged Elizabeth's role without fully accepting her as a mother figure. Elizabeth had respected the girl's need to preserve her mother's memory and had never pushed for greater intimacy. What did you tell her? I told her it was entirely up to you, but that I thought Sarah would want her to have a mother's love in her life, even if it came from someone else. Tears sprang to Elizabeth's eyes. I would be honored if she wanted to call me Mama. Then you should tell her that. She's been worried that it would hurt your feelings if she didn't, and that it would dishonor her mother's memory if she did. That evening, Elizabeth found Anna sitting on the front porch, reading by the light of an oil lamp. The girl looked up as Elizabeth approached her face, thoughtful and serious beyond her years. Anna, Elizabeth said, settling beside her on the wooden bench. Your father told me about your question yesterday. Anna's cheeks flushed slightly. Oh, I want you to know that whatever you choose to call me, it won't change how I feel about you. You're my daughter in every way that matters, regardless of words. But what about my real Mama? Anna asked quietly. If I call you Mama, does that mean I'm forgetting her? Elizabeth thought carefully before answering. Do you remember the story your father told me about your mother, about how she said every girl deserved a happy ending? Anna nodded. I think your mother would want you to be happy above all else. I think she'd want you to feel loved and safe and part of a complete family. And I think she'd understand that loving me doesn't mean you love her any less. Anna was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Then she turned to Elizabeth, with tears gleaming in her eyes. I do love you, she said softly. And I would like to call you Mama, if that's really all right. It's more than all right, Elizabeth replied, pulling the girl into a fierce embrace. It would make me the happiest woman in 3 territories. As they sat together on the porch, Will came running around the corner of the house, his face bright with excitement about something he discovered in the barn. When he saw them talking seriously, he slowed his approach. What's happening? he asked, sensing the emotional weight of the moment. Anna has decided she'd like to start calling me Mama, Elizabeth explained. Will's face lit up with joy. Really? That's wonderful. I've been calling you Mama in my head for months. But I didn't want to make Anna feel bad. Anna laughed through her tears. You should have said something silly. I was thinking the same thing. As the three of them sat together in the gentle evening air, sharing stories and dreams for the future, Elizabeth marveled at the strange journey that had brought her to this place. She'd lost everything she thought mattered: her name, her friends, her carefully planned future. But she'd gained something infinitely more precious. She had a family who loved her unconditionally, children who looked to her for guidance and comfort, and a husband who saw her as she truly was and cherished her anyway. She had meaningful work that challenged and fulfilled her, a community that respected and valued her contributions, and a home where she belonged completely. Most importantly, she'd learned that courage wasn't about not being afraid, it was about choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and family over everything else that might try to tear them apart. That night, as Elizabeth Reed for that, was her name now completely and legally prepared for bed beside her husband, she thought about the letter she'd received earlier that week. It was from the territorial governor, offering her a position as superintendent of schools for the entire region, a role that would allow her to expand educational opportunities throughout the frontier. It was an honor she'd never dreamed of, recognition that her work was valued and needed. But as she looked around the bedroom she shared with Mason at the photographs of their family on the dresser and the children's artwork decorating the walls, she knew her answer. This was where she belonged. Not in some administrative office in the territorial capital, but here in this house, with these people who'd chosen to love her. Her mission wasn't to reform education across the frontier. It was to raise these specific children to love this particular man and to build this one perfect family. Any regrets? Mason asked as they settled into bed together, echoing the question Deputy Marshal Wade had asked at their wedding. None, Elizabeth replied, just as she had that night. Well, maybe one small one. What's that? Elizabeth smiled in the darkness. I wish this story could go on forever. I wish we could stay exactly like this, perfectly happy for the rest of our lives. Maybe we can, Mason said, pulling her close. Maybe that's what happiness really is. Not a destination you reach, but a choice you make every single day. Outside their window, where the wind sighed through the mountains, carrying with it the scents of pine and wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow. Inside their home, a family slept peacefully safe, in the knowledge that they'd found something worth fighting for, and strong enough to last. The story was complete. The new life had truly begun. Elizabeth Reed closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the love she'd fought so hard to find, and knowing that tomorrow would bring new adventures with the family she'd chosen and who had chosen her in return. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, but the sound held no menace, now only the wild, free song of the frontier that had tested them all and found them worthy of the happiness they'd built together. The past was finally at peace. The future stretched ahead like an open road. And in the small ranch house nestled in the Colorado mountains, 4 people who had found each other against all odds slept soundly, knowing that some stories, the best stories, really do have happy endings.